Huh? Yeah, I think so. Everything goes right Monday. And there'll be a few we haven't done, but I want to talk about them then. Okay, so let's go ahead then and get where we started here. Oh, is this I like chemistry. Everybody's mind works differently for different things. I understand that completely. All right, so did we get to what kind of government is government by representation? Republic. And what did each of these states pass some kind of thing to enumerate their certain, I want to say rights? What did they pass? What do we call them? Yeah, some kind of Bill of Rights. A Bill of Rights, and that goes kind of a British tradition. And, oh, what was it called where they wanted to alleviate the difference between the classes? So it's not, and when the Industrial Revolution would hit, what would they call leveling? Communism. It's actually communism is a version of it, socialism. Yeah, socialism. Now, that does not at all mean no socialist believes everybody should be equal, but it's just difference in leveling the classes. So it's a different way of saying. Obviously, you know, communism, socialism, there's anarchists or socialists. There's all kinds of different types of socialists. Industrial Revolution is really going to change everything. Hey, we read every day. We'd say a pledge out written by a socialist. Well, so does.
Well, some of us can say pledge, and some of us cannot.
I have a great amount of sympathy for that. To say it into a little box, that would be hard.
Gavin just he doesn't do well with public speaking, and he never has, and he's not getting better. It's hard.
Okay, so what else do we call it? It's not the true form of this, but this idea that more and more Americans, at least white men, believe that they should have a greater voice in government. Democracy. That's democracy. Have more power, more sovereignty. A true democracy is people vote on everything. That comes from ancient Athens, and it basically means that all the demos or citizens, they vote for every single thing, which we don't have. Yeah, because we'd be like, okay, are we going to vote for the treaty with, or to allow Finland into NATO? And then our next vote will be, should it be a traffic light on the corner of Maple and 6th in downtown Cleveland? We have to vote on everything. So that's why representation gives you an advantage. So did we get to here?
Yeah.
Did we get to weak central government?
Yes.
Did we say how many votes per state?
Yes. One vote per state.
Does this favor big states or small states? Small, yeah, by population, small. I mean, Montana's a very small state.
Yes.
That has a lot of empty space. And did I get to this?
Yeah. Yes.
Did we get to this?
No.
So to change this thing requires 13 votes. So here's the point. Will anything ever be passed?
No.
Nothing. This kind of supermajority means that nothing, especially anything controversial, will ever be passed. And depending upon how divided the country is, even uncontroversial stuff would be passed. And then 13 to amend, can't change it. Can't change it. I mean, they wanted to avoid a tyranny, but they ended up creating something that can get nothing done. And then to avoid the tyrant, that person to enforce the laws, to take the law from Congress, interpret it, and then enforce it, they were worried that would be a tyrant. That person is called, oh, we already said that, an executive. There's no executive. Who's the executive of the United States today? Yeah, Joe Biden, the president. Who's the executive of Montana? Every state in the union has to be a republic. Who's the executive of Montana? Governor Gianforte. The governor is. Cities are a little bit different.
Anything there was no executive?
Yeah, no executive. Without an executive, there's no one to carry out the laws. Now, I want to be very clear about it. Whoever carries out and interprets the laws, they have immense power. So they didn't want that person. The problem is then, even if there is a law passed, who will carry it out? Well, what they said was the individual, no one will carry out the laws, the individual states will carry it out. So they're going to ask the states, what if the state doesn't like that law? We don't like that one, so not going to happen here. I think there's elements of that now, but there's a clear hierarchy. The federal government, the national government is supreme. And so there is a hierarchy. This didn't exist. It wasn't clear. So what gets done? Oops. Well, look about what happens. See what happens. There's no power to tax. That means they have to ask the states to collect taxes. Well, they're not going to do that, or they might. Some will, some won't. They're going to expect the state to collect taxes and then give a percentage of that to the new national government, meaning virtually no tax revenue will be coming. A disaster. If you can't tax, you don't have a state, a country. It just doesn't exist. And so what it means is, if you can't tax, you can't borrow money. They can issue bonds. They can issue them. But who would ever buy a bond from the United States if they can't tax? So therefore, interest rates have got to go sky high to convince them to borrow it, which means even more money to pay back with a government that can't tax. If you can't tax, you don't have a country. It just doesn't exist. It'll fall apart. Got to be able to tax. Now, I've got to be clear. Once again, I'll say this every time I mention this because it's such a key point. Nobody likes to pay taxes. But someone has to be the grown-up and say, yes, but this is what we have to do to have a country. Therefore, they can't control the money supply. So how much money is in circulation, or for that matter, what is even money? They have no control. If you can't control the money supply, you don't have a financial system, you don't have a country. And so there's no currency that has value. If you can't tax, you can't issue currency. Oh, they can issue it, but no one knows what it's worth because would you trust it? We become Argentina, which prices are going up dramatically. Of course, for this whole system, we're more like Somalia. We don't have a market to function. So the currency has no value. And it's really inconsistent. And then you can't control inflation or deflation. If you have too high of inflation where prices are going up and value money is going down, government can do nothing. If there's deflation and the value money is going up but no one has money to pay things, they can't pay back their debts, can do nothing. And so the point about that is that if you can't control inflation or deflation, there's virtually no business activity, no speculation, no investment, no savings, nothing. Foreign policy. There's no one to speak for foreign policy. That means 13 states can negotiate with other countries or each other. For example, treaty. What treaty ended the war, the Revolutionary War? Remember, it said New Orleans would be used to open up the Mississippi for Western commerce. New Orleans? Spain's looking at this disaster here and they said, no, we're going to charge a toll and block it. We couldn't enforce the Treaty of Paris. The British stayed here and were actively trading with various tribes all over the Great Lakes region. Spain made massive claims here. The United States was supposed to have fishing rights right about here in the Atlantic. Royal Navy vessels kicked us off. And there's nothing the United States can do because we have no one to speak for us. Not only that, an important part of foreign policy is to set up trade, to set up agreements. What do you call a tax on imports? Tariff or excise tax. They don't exist, so trade is just, no one has any idea. commercial rules. Every state's going to have their own tariffs. They'll put tariffs on each other. It's chaos. And could you imagine every time you go into Idaho, Wyoming, North Dakota, or South Dakota, our lovely border states, and we'd have to go through customs office and go and give our passport and maybe pay a tax. And they go through your stuff every time. It would be, well, let's put it this way, you wouldn't do it. And so that stifles trade. And I know all of you are thinking, well, I'm going to North Dakota. I got to go to North Dakota. It's a great place for a Christmas break because the weather is beautiful in North Dakota. Oh. There's nothing to stop the wind from Hudson Bay, so you just get to enjoy the winter. No armed forces. There's no army. You can't create an army if you can't tax. There's no leadership of the army. If there's no army, what's going to stop the British from coming in and taking the Great Lakes region again, which they seriously considered? Or for that matter, we're going to control the Mississippi. Or we're going to blockade your harbors. They're going to rely on state militias, but same deal. Will the states have to send them? They do. I don't know, sure. This will still be an issue in the War of 1812. And the assumption was militias would be there, but don't forget, everyone has different types of militia too. What section of the country, north or south, will have stronger militias? And why would the south? Slavery. A lot different than the north. There's no federal court system at all. No federal courts. So what do you do if there's a disagreement between states or a person in one state sues someone else in another state? There's no way to establish it. There's no ultimate court of appeals and the last court of resort. You know, states might have a Supreme Court, but every other state will have their own Supreme Court. And so nothing exists. It's just chaos. For example, what does a cobbler do? Shoes. Cobbles, thank you for saying that. What do they make? Shoes. Cobblers in New York is a good value-added steel position. Yet Britain, with the Industrial Revolution, was starting to at least make half of the shoe production was now mechanized machines. They could cut their costs. New York was, or Britain was dumping shoes, sending their low-priced shoes into New York. What happens to the cobblers if all of a sudden these low-priced shoes come in? They go out of business, they lose everything. The cobblers have a little bit of money, a little bit of political power back then, so they got the state to put a tariff on British shoes. Can we get the story here now? Keep it. Oh, so you have to write this word down. I didn't write it on the board, but put down, this is, I should put it on the board. Protectionism. Put it right here. Protection. Or actually another way, a protective tariff. It protects your industry. Protectionism or protective. You put a high tariff to protect your industry. In this case, they're trying to protect the cobblers. What?
Sorry, it's not the state of
Say it again. One more time. It protects, a protecting tariff is a high tariff to protect your domestic industry.
What is it?
A tariff is a tax on imports.
Okay, all right.
So it raises the prices of imports. So it raises the prices of shoes, so it doesn't. So British shoes can't undercut American cobblers. Connecticut didn't have a tariff. So what did Britain do? Britain dumped shoes into New Haven. They put them in wagons, took them into New York. So what did New York do? They put a tariff on Connecticut. Connecticut put a tariff on New York. New York cut off their border with their state militia. Connecticut militia met them in a face-off on the only road between Connecticut and New York. And in 1786, they went to war. Not a full-scale war, but they're shooting at each other. Connecticut and New York. And there's nothing the government can do about it. There's no court system to decide this tariff issue. There's no one to control the foreign policy or trade. There's no armed forces that the United States government can send, let alone an executive branch to do anything. All they can say is, hey, you guys, cut it out. So nothing got done. And New York did the same thing with New Jersey the next year. What's that? You know what's interesting about that is when the Civil War began, the city of New York talked about being neutral. We're kind of a neutral city. So there's always, like New Jersey, the state of New Jersey, as a group, New Jersey hates me. So, do you get the point here? This is a real problematic government. The idea is not to create a tyranny has created anarchy. One more thing. The person who beats the gavel in charge of the Confederation Congress, they had a title. They're just a member of the Congress. They're the one who they beat the gavel, let's start the meeting, they organize the meetings, and they were called the President of the United States. And so the first president of the United States was not with the title. That actual title was not George Washington. It was a guy named John Hanson. But he had no powers of the president today, except to beat the gavel. He just was a voting member of the Confederation Congress. And so there's actually a bunch of presidents before Washington. So it was just decided, because the term was in use, well, when they wrote the Constitution, let's call the executive the president. You know, they're not going to call him prime minister. That's too British. So you see all these problems. This is all underlying the real issues that we're making the real issues that much more dangerous. Now, the first area this really came to head was in Western lands. All of these lands here, remember I mentioned this once before, you have all these different claims. States had these colonial claims. Virginia claimed everything. Massachusetts had claims. You know, South Carolina and Georgia claimed here. The point is, all these competing claims from the old colonies. And it was not clear. Do colonial claims still matter when it's a new country? Well, you can imagine Virginia saying, yes. Rhode Island saying, what do we care? No. What do you do about this? But there's something else. All these colonies and then new states, they issued bonds for themselves. State bonds, and they have to pay it back. They don't have money either. So their plan to get rid of that debt was to sell off this land. So Virginia is thinking, we're going to need help with our debt. We'll sell off what's going to be Ohio. We'll sell it to what's somebody who buys land cheap and sells it for a profit? Speculators. So speculators have a vested interest. Those who are borrowing money from creditors and thinking, we'll scoop up this land. And they're selling it to them. If you have a title, a piece of paper that says you own this land, from Virginia, does the United States have to respect that? Or for that matter, New York or anybody else? Here's the point. We don't know. Couldn't they just take it to the Supreme Court? There's no courts. So this is chaos. So what they came up with is this. I almost forgot one other thing. Squatters. Here we're just coming in and moving in. Who's the most famous squatter we said before? Before David Crockett. Begins with a D, though. Daniel Boone. I know, they kind of go hand in hand. You know, because in American folklore, Crockett and Daniel Boone, even though they were born in different eras. So, one more thing. This area was always very tedious. It's divided by the Appalachian Mountains. And it's a real fear that the Union might break away. The Union might dissolve if the West breaks away. And that was a fear throughout this entire era, that states would just say, goodbye, we're going to form our own place. Especially if they can't have a connection. So they need some kind of local government. And they knew that the people who lived here didn't necessarily want to be part of Virginia. I'm going to live here. Rephrase that. They didn't want to be part of Virginia. So 2 laws would be passed by the Confederation Congress which are still the laws of the land today. So two things came from this disastrous government in many ways. It wasn't all bad, at least the goals, it's just disastrous outcomes. So with all this government land, I call federal land as the national government. The term federal will be used more and more going into the 19th century. And they needed that land to sell. So they would survey it. They send out hundreds of surveyors to survey all the land. And they did it by latitude and longitude. They figured out ranges and came up with basically a grid pattern. If you ever look at a map of Montana, it is divided up in a grid pattern. That grid comes from the land ordinance of 1785. And they would create a township, a 6 by 6 mile square. So it's just 6 by 6 mile. Therefore, you have a square piece of land they could divvy up. And they had a procedure for rivers and that kind of thing. So just think about straight land, divided up. And then each township will be divided up into 1 by 1 mile sections. And then you can divide the sections into half sections, quarter sections, etc. And that way there's a method to sell land. And so a state map of Montana, it's all checkerboard, and it'll have private ownership, state ownership, federal government still owns it, just this huge checkerboard. And if you go to places that are really flat, every county roads are like designed on this checkerboard. If you're looking at the state map of Iowa, it just everything's north, south, east, west, it's all these section lines. And if the government sells these sections, the money from one land will go to education. And that is going to set the precedent for public education, with this idea that all Americans should have access to education. Now, it's unclear what that meant, but this amazing apparatus that you have now will be starting there. And it's kind of an amazing thing. Public education is really kind of amazing. You have this apparatus that's built around you, regardless of your income. You can come in here, and it's all designed for you. I know a lot of you think, oh no, they're making me do this, and this money's going to work. Yeah, but it's all for you. And it's what else is amazing in the United States. All this is done for you. And once you graduate, that's done. And then it's sink or swim. And so we have an interesting thing where we have this apparatus to care for you, and then it literally just ends. So it's an amazing place, but then there is a finite amount to it. I'm kind of in awe of what happens here. You know the way schools function, or some of you might have an idea. It's actually really amazing how good it works. And so, big deal. But now what? Okay, we'll survey the land. I should add, what about squatters? So Kentucky's going to be really weird. And these original states, it's already been decided. So that doesn't happen there. And down the road, you see this in other places, like, for example, Texas came in as an independent country. It was an independent country, became part of the United States. And so it isn't surveyed like this. Hawaii was an independent country that the United States conquered and took. So it's not like this. And so you see it different places. California was an independent country for a short time, so it's a kind of a gray area. And so that's how it works. Township divided up. A quarter township would be seen as like the ideal size for a farm for years, 160 acres. That might work in Ohio, but Ohio has something called rain. It would not work here at all. The first state they surveyed was Ohio, the first state. And so, what about the actual states? Even a year before the land ordinance, Thomas Jefferson came up with an idea. He called it the Land Ordinance of 84. I know I'm going back, but it will make sense. And what he said was, okay, we haven't figured out the way to survey it yet, but we'll divide this up into 14 states. He wanted lots of states. He thought that would be more small d democratic, they could be more even by population. And Jefferson, by then, he was the ambassador, the United States ambassador to Paris. So he was living in Paris at this time. I don't know, ambassador to what? Speaking for the Confederation Congress, he had nothing. But that was his idea. But here's the big thing. Jefferson understood one very important thing. If the system of slavery spreads westward, the republic will die. Jefferson knew the republic would die. And so he proposed 14 new states without slave codes west of the Appalachian Mountains. Remember slave codes? Now, you guys took a test yesterday. I asked questions and you had to write either fornication laws or Bacon's Rebellion. And I told you when I was reviewing that I didn't include racism because they're so tied together. Well, both Bacon's Rebellion and fornication laws. One thing I was really looking for in there, most of you had it, but a lot of you didn't, the words slave codes. Fornication laws was the biggest of the slave codes. Bacon's Rebellion led directly to slave codes. Slave codes were huge. And the other thing I was looking for is both Bacon's Rebellion and laws like the fornication laws and what slave codes were there too. Racism. So that's an example of the kind of thing I really needed to have. No, I didn't take, you still got points for it, you didn't have that. Most of the points. But I took points off of it. But me saying it, I hope you're all, if you didn't write it down, I hope you're thinking. And I'm looking at some of your faces and you're like, yeah. It happens. I know. But that's the kind of thing I want. All right. Why? Jefferson knew. He knew slavery equals tyranny. Tyranny was the exact thing they fought against with the British. There can be no freedom of speech if there's slavery. There can be no democracy if there's slavery. There can't be. Because what happens if the people are talking, if they have unlimited free speech, and you have free people saying slavery is wrong? That might encourage a slave rebellion. What if you have democracy and you let regular people vote and they decide, you know, we don't like having my job competing with slaves, and I want to get rid of it. The people with slaves can't allow that, so they demand tyranny. Slavery equals tyranny for everybody, including those who don't and never will have slaves. It is a restriction on everybody's rights. And who knew it? And what did Jefferson have? So Jefferson knew everything that he based his fine lifestyle on was tyranny. But he liked his wine. He liked his mansion. And he liked his lifestyle. So he wanted to ban slave codes, hoping down the road the United States will get rid of slavery. After he's what? Dead. Jefferson is a kind of a very good example of so many of the problems in the United States. Because he's clearly right. And yet, okay, so they got 8 votes. 8 votes. Huh? No, 8 votes in the Confederation Congress. How many you need?
9.
Anybody want to guess the states that voted against it? And Maryland. Now, almost every state except Pennsylvania still had slaves, but the slaveholders had significantly less power in these states. And Delaware would keep slave codes into the Civil War. But the slave owners had very little power. Maryland down, slave owners ran the states. Someone had their hand up. Yeah. It operated much the same way as the Continental Congress, but it is a new form of government. And so it is directly tied to the states, where the Continental Congress wasn't directly tied. The Continental Congress, they kind of gave themselves the power. The Confederation Congress, the members would have to be chosen by the states. So it was a little bit different. But a lot of the same members just transferred over. And the same kind of anarchy existed in both. This is one of the great what ifs in history. What if? What if that would have happened? And it's too bad because the state names Jefferson picked were awesome. I'll show you a few. So a compromise would come, now it took 2 years later, and this is the next law. This is still the law of the land. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787. It's called the Land Ordinance officially, but everybody calls it the Northwest Ordinance. And here's some of the names. Saratoga, Washington. Metropolitania would have been great. Yeah, that's Asadapia. That sounds good. Michigania. Illinois. Yes, Chernosius. That sounds good. Sylvania. Transylvania. I got Pelasipia. Transylvania's down here. I know it's sad.
Why does she?
Oh, Polypotamia. That's a good one. I know. We're stuck with Ohio. Okay. So what it said was, if there's 5,000 people living in a designated area, they can become a territory. Now, that means they can get a territorial constitution, but it's done by the federal government. You, the president, will appoint a territorial government. Unless Congress passes a law that will give them a little more autonomy. It's still federal territory, but it has a government. And so 5,000 people, pretty low barrier. And so up until like 1971, Washington, D.C. was like this. The Washington, D.C.'s laws were done by the federal, by Congress. The president appointed their mayor. But then Congress would give them the power to have mostly self-government. Same thing happened in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, they're American citizens, that's an American territory. But they're a territory, but they're allowed to have their own territorial governor that they vote on. Yes, obviously, Puerto Rico is significantly bigger than 5,000 people. It's significantly bigger than Montana population-wise. But for various reasons, it has not been allowed to become a state. What's that? The main reason right now is Republicans do not want it. Because almost certainly it would be Democrats. So that's 2 more Democratic senators and probably 5 or 6 Democratic members of the House. Same reason they won't let Washington, D.C. become a state. So, 60,000 people to become a state. 60,000 people. That's really low bar, especially today. But it's still the law of the land. So they can apply for statehood, therefore have their own constitution. Now, it's unclear if they'll be equal. That was unclear. Would a new state like Ohio have the same equality of membership in the nation as the original 13? That's still unclear. It would be decided technically yes. Next, what about these states? Well, remember, Jefferson said all without slave codes. They decided to compromise more than anything else because the people moving in were, for the most part, not bringing in slaves. And so what they said is the 5 states north of the Ohio, no slave codes. No slave codes. So you kind of said it in a section of the bottom. Now, in future talk, when I say no slave codes, I will say slave states or free states. No slave states, that's a free state. But what it means is no slave codes. Slave state, slave state. Good. But now, it wasn't so much the plan, but they kind of knew it's going to happen. If you say that these areas are going to be free, by implication, what does it mean, these states? So they'll have slave codes. It just implies to slaveholders, if you want to force your slaves at gunpoint to go over the mountains and take land here, they'll probably have slave codes. And so this will become the divide. North and South, slavery. It starts with the Northwest Ordinance. That's a big deal. It set up the sectional divide. It didn't quite exist before. It was growing. But now it's there. So the Ohio River would be that divide. And there's another big question. What if we get more land? Where will slave codes go? I'm sure there'll be no issue with that. Everyone's going to come together and come up with a compromise that'll work for everybody, especially the slaves, right? Because it's all they. And by no means will that be a trigger of a war that will kill 800,000 Americans. By no means. Don't worry. Nothing to see here. So that is that's the Northwest Act. Oh, South Carolina would keep this claim all the way till the next sentence. They refused to accept. They didn't give this line. South Carolina. Too small for a country, too big for an insane asylum. Okay. So people started moving west. That's a picture of going to the Ohio. That's what they called the Ohio. But back to the issues that were breaking up the country. And I know what you're thinking, oh, we haven't got to the money supply in nearly 20 minutes. Yes, the money supply. The value of money. And those are all examples of U.S. currency. And you have some from New York. Here's from the United States Congress. I mean, some are dollars. Some are using the term shilling, which is from Britain. There was no set money. It was chaos. Every time you go into a merchant and try to make, you'd have to make a deal. I'll give you a few Spanish pesos, some New York currency. Oh, I have some currency from the city of Philadelphia. Will you take that? Everything took forever, meaning if it takes forever, it doesn't happen. And so, just to review, inflation, deflation. We know inflation, the value of money does what in inflation? What happens to prices? We just have very, very, if you want low inflation, very, very good news, at least to the point of view of low inflation. The core inflation looks like it's down below the trigger mark for who controls the money supply in the United States today? Treasury has a little bit of influence, but it's the president appoints members of it, but they, by law, operate outside the political framework. I don't know if that's a good thing. The law was 1913. Does that help? You know it. And you can't leave. I'll lock the doors. You have to stay there all weekend until you come up with the Federal Reserve.
Oh, all right.
But all of you probably heard the Federal Reserve. They're the ones who control the money supply. I will go in more detail down the road, things we build to. But deflation, value money does what? Inflation goes up. Deflation, what happens to prices? Go down, so your dollar buys more. Now, if you're just simply buying products, that sounds like a good thing. Large deflation destroys countries. Large deflation leads to revolution. Large deflation in a place called Germany would lead to Nazi Germany. So deflation, we can handle relatively high inflation. Deflation's a disaster. So who's benefited by inflation? The creditor or debtor? Debtor or creditor? Debtor? You're right. Now let me draw you the table Y. This is the time, and I know all of you like tic-tac-toe, so let's play a little tic-tac-toe.
Love it.
So XO, where do we put the X?
Middle.
Always the middle, right? I lied when I put it. Will you ever believe me again? All right. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to do. We're going to make a little table, and here is today. That's or toady. Today, $100. I loan you $100 today. 1 year from now, in real terms, you pay me back $100. Now, when I say in real terms is, I owe you $100, you pay me back $100. I loan you $100, you give me $100, no interest, just straight deal, right? 1 year. But in real means we're taking inflation or deflation into account. So what we're going to say is this. If it's $100 today, what will the purchasing power be in a year? Will it still buy $100 worth of stuff it would have bought today? So let's get to two different examples. 10% inflation, 10% deflation. Huh?
I don't like this.
This is math. So in real terms, I give you $100. So it's $100, $100, right? Both scenarios. The first scenario 1, 10% inflation. How much is the purchasing power of that? 90. What's that? 90, because the value of dollars went down 10%. So it can only buy $90 worth of stuff. That's the purchasing power. I still have $100, but it doesn't buy, it buys 10% less stuff. Make sense? Now let's go deflation. What does it buy? 110. So I loan you $100. If there's inflation, you pay me back money that's now worth the purchasing power of 90. Or if there's inflation. If there's deflation, you pay me back money of greater value, 110. Which one do I prefer? Don't I like deflation? If I'm the creditor, I loaned you the money. I didn't do anything. I didn't even charge interest, yet I made wealth off that $100. You lost, but it was inflation. I lost wealth, and therefore you gained wealth because you got to spend that $100 when it was still worth 100. Money supply decides wealth. Money supply decides what your dollar will be worth. Money supply decides everything. Now, if we have 10% deflation, it's rioting in the streets and the country falls apart. I'll give you an example. 1932 America. It just about fell apart. Why? Massive deflation. So they're not directly related. 10% inflation we could deal with. It'd be pretty hard, prices would be going up. So creditors are helped by which one now? Deflation. Now, what they really wanted, look at it this way. Creditors want almost no inflation. Debtors want a little bit of inflation. If there's inflation and you're in debt, it's easier to pay back your debt. Everyone got that? I know what you're saying. Wait a minute, this sounds like finance and economics. Yeah, and that decides everything. Why do you think we have a constitution? Inflation, deflation. That is why. It wasn't people sitting in rooms saying, let's ponder what's best for the country. No, it's like, oh, we have a revolution coming. We got to do something. So, we're back up. I got this wrong order. There's multiple currencies out there then. And the value of that is dropping. Nobody knows what anything's worth. And the gold coin, remember that specie? That's the only thing people trust, and that's going up in value. The point is, nobody knows what money's worth. Nobody knows the money supply. Nobody knows anything. And therefore, if you want a market to function, AKA business, finance, the distribution of goods, you need the government to control the money supply. If that does not exist, you don't have an economy. You become Somalia. That's what it kind of looked like the United States was becoming. Do you know what happened? What Somalia is like? Somalia does not have a government. It's run by individual warlords. It's just there's. So, what about Confederation currency? Has no value because they can't tax. And so, even if the Confederation says, "Oh, we'll step in and we'll save the situation by issuing currency," it doesn't work. So the market cannot function. And here's the biggie. If the market can't function, you can't plan for the future. If you can't plan for the future, everything becomes even a bigger risk. It becomes scary. If you're not sure what tomorrow will bring, that adds stress, panic. If you don't know if you can feed your family, you're terrified today. And if you're terrified, what do? Could it be almost anything? This is a scary time. Stability matters. So, the debt crisis just keeps getting worse. The debt crisis gets worse and worse and worse. So, what we have is a post-war depression. There's no demand. Nobody's buying anything. There's no regular market function. Now, I didn't put this down. If people are scared to buy and they can't buy, it's hard to get money. No one knows what to spend. And people aren't selling things. But if there's no demand, what happens to prices? Prices drop. So you have to put down no demand. You write this down. Prices drop. Prices drop, there's no demand. Make sense? So people are scared to buy stuff. Prices drop because they got to convince people to buy stuff. Well, if stores can't buy stuff, can they pay back their debt? So there's more debt. So here's the three things. No demand, prices drop, you're going to have more debt. If people have more debt, are they going to spend money? So that means less what? Demand, which means lower prices, which means more debt, which means less demand. Do you see that cycle? We actually have a name for it. And we'll get to this when we get to what's called the business cycle. They actually call it the deflationary curve. And if you go in that, once it starts going, it's really difficult to stop. I mean, if you're not sure what tomorrow's going to be, what are you probably going to do? Hoard your money and sit back, which means less demand, lower prices, and more debt. Has this happened in your lifetime? Yes, it happened in 2008, 2009, 2010. It was bad. Huh? There was a little bit of this during COVID, but because of direct, very aggressive government action, both under a moderate President Biden and a conservative President Trump, which is kind of surprising for a conservative president to do this, but by direct government action, it was pretty quick. It was actually really quick. 2008, 2009 took forever. Yeah. You guys did a table of the increase in.
Yeah, I saw that the car companies had to
Yeah. The car company, the big car company bailout was in 2009. And then now they're making more money than all they do. And the workers took pay cuts to help out. Because in 2009, in 2009, the car companies were already going bankrupt. So the deal was made, the US government bailed out, and the workers took pay decreases. And then now the car companies are doing well. Part of these pay decreases, the companies say, oh, well, they have. They have. That makes sense. What the last 6 months? Yeah. So the workers are saying we want. Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
I'm gonna dress up tomorrow.
I want my AirPod in my car. So now I only have one pod, and the other one's dying in my car.
So where's the way?
One.
Oh!
I didn't tell you that. We did nothing in Spanish, so.
Oh, we got to shut off the camera. You have to leave.
Wait, how to?
What do you?
I just have a question.
Wait.
Wait.
What's right?
How did all of the states just get random money?
Like they're back.
It's a combination of partially because of the river there. So you look at Delaware with the border, you have it is a lot of money.
Kate, I'm leaving.
And then some they literally just
Or like this.
Yeah. They get right over here. Yeah. And then they got surveys.
It's just so great.
And then you got Montana.
Yeah.
It's we don't have Montana, but that's a common. That's a common divide up here, and then they go along the mountain range. It's clever senators, clever politics in land. Yeah, there's a lot of land. This is like divided. One ridge. And then a lot of politics in one place. Like Michigan. That we want. And but you'll notice like here, they were taking the new lateral modulus. That was your way to say, okay, we'll divide citizens here, here. Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, you see it here. Right here. That's a 45-degree. The History Channel has some good stuff about it. How is everyone doing? Well, a lot of people have talked to me, people in your class, students, people on the street, working people, farmers, men of the soil. And they said you guys want to do another test. They wouldn't lie. The salt of the earth, are you saying? I'm great at most of your short IDs, and for the most part, I'm very pleased. I'm always going to find stuff, and I'm always going to want more information in there. But most of you have good information, you have examples, and for the first time, I thought they're very good. And I know you've written a lot before, but I really demand a lot of facts and information, which I should. And I was pleased. And as the year goes by, I'll obviously get a little bit, I'll ask a little bit more.